No, I'm not anti-car. What I am is anti-car dependency, which is that when there's no other choices, then you have to do it, right? And then that becomes the culture. But if you have more choices, I think people will use those choices. With any mobility technologies, because cities didn't get ahead of it, the impacts to the public realm, to pedestrians, to the infrastructure were unintended and also extreme. 22% of urban space in cities is dedicated to parking. Some cities like San Bernardino, that's actually 50%.
Most Modern 팟캐스트.
Welcome to Most Modern. I'm Alex Yuen. I am an architect and urbanist, teach at Harvard University. I'm joined with my co-host Mingku Kang, who is a developer teaching at MIT, and Libo Lee, who is a data engineer at Meta. Today, we're joined by Evan Shieh, who is an assistant professor of architecture at New York Institute of Technology and the author of the recent book, Towards a Transitopia, about autonomous urbanism. Evan, where do we find you today?
I am in New York, where actually recently autonomous vehicles may be arriving on our streets. But yeah, I'm based in New York here.
Wonderful. Well, you guys are a little bit behind San Francisco, where I'm right now.
Yes, we're very
Autonomous
behind.
vehicles have been here for, it seems like about a year. I remember,
Right.
I think about a year ago, I started seeing, I guess there was no one in the driver's seat. People weren't using them that much, but in the past 6 months, they've really exploded. Waymo in particular has become ultra popular. I've heard that it's surpassed Lyft in terms of market share. And now it's become kind of this sort of status quo. If you want to get somewhere and you want to go in style, you go in an autonomous vehicle.
Have you used it before when you were in San Francisco?
Yeah, I use it. I took one over the holidays when some friends were in town, some folks were in town, and then everyone wants to try it out.
Yeah, it's a good thing to show when people come to the West Coast.
Yeah, well, it's crazy that a place like San Francisco has that and they have all the other problems, but we'll get to that at a different time, maybe. But let's just jump right in. I mean, Evan, you've written this book about autonomous vehicles, about urbanism as it relates to transit. Can you explain how the current built environment is shaped by automobiles, and how do AVs, in particular autonomous vehicles, change that paradigm?
I think that's really a big portion of what the book puts on the table. And I would say I think there's maybe three major buckets that I write about, but also like your question asked, how automobiles have really kind of shaped our architecture, our built environment. So I think, if you the first I think is and the most obvious is our infrastructure, our mobility infrastructure, right? So that's our streets and highways. And if you look at recent history and actually just the history of cities, right, it was only very recently, if you look at the past, half century really, in which cities have actually been reshaped for the automobile, right? And primarily our streets and the construction of our highways, which is primarily for only automobile use, right? But streets, in their past have actually served a multitude of other uses historically. It's like what they call organized chaos of multiple uses. And only with the invention of the automobile and the arrival of the automobile and the proliferation of the automobile through interest groups, political groups, that then we kind of redirected the use of our mobility infrastructure for cars as the primary use, right? And kind of segregated all other uses to edges of streets. The other scale, I think, or the other kind of bucket I would say is urban form, right? And this is one bucket we think about a lot as architects, designers trained to think about this, but the public doesn't often. And what I mean by urban form is, the scale of our blocks, right? Their dimensions and radii and turning radii and even the land uses of the blocks that have begun to be adopted to automobiles, right? So even if we think about like our single family zone blocks, right, driveways and parking garages, right, that start to format, right, and even super blocks, right? The invention of the super block was actually distinctly tied to a hierarchy of transportation, and particularly the automobile, right, that enabled a lot of these modernist super blocks. And then even things like car-centric architecture and buildings, and these like litter our cities from parking garages, which is the most obvious kind of typology, but even things like drive-through restaurants or motels or gas stations or these other kind of car-centric buildings that literally service the dimension of the car. And all of this kind of falls under this big bucket, I think, which is parking, right? Parking has really the accommodation of parking in the automobile and the large amount of space it takes up, that has been a fundamental kind of root of the way our cities kind of are organized and kind of proliferate the automobile in cities, both from street parking, but also parking garages, parking lots. If you look at the statistics, like I think 22% of urban space in cities, which is almost a quarter, it's kind of crazy if you think about it, is dedicated to parking. And then, some cities like San Bernardino in California, that's actually 50%. It's kind of crazy. And so, to shift the focus back to AVs, right? I think that hinge, right? The land release from parking is actually the huge opportunity that AVs give us, especially if we shift to a service model, right? Like mobility as a service, in which we consume mobility like through autonomous driving, through like kind of like transportation networks like Uber and Lyft, right? Where we don't own a vehicle anymore, and then you don't therefore have to dedicate all this space to storing that vehicle, a vehicle that 95% of its lifetime is parked and vacant, right? And that it's also estimated that there are 8 parking spots for every household or every car that's owned, right? That's not just at home, but all over the city where when you drive, you need to park somewhere. So that land released, right? It's amazing to think about what that could be if we can reclaim that space for more productive uses like landscape, social uses, or densify it with affordable housing and other things like this, right? So yeah.
So it's definitely fascinating that vehicles have kind of shaped our built environment in such a way. Is this a uniquely American phenomenon? Cars are very tied to the American identity. You can, anecdotally pretty much guess who will stop at a stop sign based on what car they drive. So like, how does this happen in America versus the rest of the world?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a uniquely American phenomenon. The global impacts have been felt, but I would say America has uniquely embraced the automobile as part of its culture and identity. Actually, that's what I write about in the book too, and that's a huge part of this conversation, which is the celebration of the automobile, both culturally, but also notoriously through top-down kind of political interests, right? And we kind of synonymize, or I don't even know if that's a word, but we kind of assume that we are culture and we are certainly have been as such, but that has come not necessarily because we made that choice, but because political groups, interest groups have kind of forced that choice or forced that kind of decision upon cities, and then we react to those choices. But of course, around the world, automobiles have shaped all cities, right? All we think about streets mostly now as for vehicle use. But I think in cities in which it was harder to adopt our automobiles into architecture, into the urban fabric, they have retained a little more of that walkability, a little more of the kind of like pedestrian, right? Like so in like a lot more historic cities, right? You see more of that friction, and you also see less of automobiles that's like winning out, right, in that fight between pedestrians and cities. And because you have that historic urban fabric that wasn't designed around the dimension of the car, right? And also, automobiles came at a time in America in which, there was massive urbanization and suburbanization, right? So there was an opportunity for urban planners at that time here in the US to design cities for that technology at that time, right? So that evolution that history is distinctly tied. Yeah.
So those trends were very clear in the 60s, and it was also backed by urban economic theories like the monocentric cities. And those kind of tendencies also continue at the current times, where New York and Boston, there's a clear CBD in those cities, but you chose LA, which is quite different. It's not a monocentric city. It's more closer to a polycentric city. And why was that? Why did you choose to do this study based in LA?
LA that's a great question, and as you all know, and maybe the listener doesn't know yet, but the book kind of situates Los Angeles as the test bed city, and it talks about this topic more generally, right? But I think it puts on the table, design strategies and planning strategies and policy strategies that are intentionally tested against the friction of a real city and the issues of a real city as a way to kind of get into the actual possibilities, right? But also to extrapolate the lessons for other cities. And so LA was chosen for a couple of reasons, and the most, I think, simplest is that, it's a city that's near and dear to my heart. I did my undergraduate degree there, and I lived there for almost a decade. But aside from that reason, so, that's a kind of a lived experience that I'm quite familiar with. There's actually many other more, let's say, academic reasons that make LA kind of a really interesting and an important prototype city. So firstly, right, when we just talked about car culture, right, like LA is one of the most distinctly American cities that has been in its recent history associated and synonymous with car culture, right? And Rainer Banham wrote a whole ecology called Autopia in his book Four Ecologies of LA, which was about the way the city has been shaped around the culture of the car, and the built environment has been shaped around car transportation. And so if there's any city that, let's say, in its current era needs this kind of thinking or needs a kind of revisiting of the relationship that its mobility hub choices have made on its architecture and urban form, it's that city, right? And then the second, though, even more interesting, I think, is that the city has in its DNA actually historically not auto-based or urbanism, right? So it was actually founded on the expansion of its rail lines, the Pacific Rail Electric Company, which created the sprawl of the city, right? People think that the car created the sprawl in LA. It wasn't the car. It was actually streetcar suburbs, right? So an expansion of the suburbs through streetcar systems. And it was only when the car came and that, system was dismantled, that then the car and the highways in LA were actually built over the backbones of these streetcar kind of rail lines that radiated out actually monocentrically. And that is now the highway network of the city. And then the car, I think, was what brought the kind of more polycentric nature of the city, and the sprawl on the land that kind of entailed. And so in recent years, though, LA also, in recognition of the kind of nature of its the issues of car-centric urbanism, in the past, let's say 25 or like 5 to 10 years, has actually put a lot of investment back into transit through Measure R, Measure M, right? The citizens voted to self-tax themselves to give Metro like over 120 billion in funding to create the next generation of a transit system in the city. And so we didn't talk about this yet in the book, but it argues for how AVs should be used by transportation agencies to support transit systems and not just car-based, individual transport, right? So it actually works a lot with the trends of what the city wants and what it's going towards. And so that's another reason why I think, it's very ripe for that exploration.
So we're at a moment in, I guess, history, basically, where we're getting more agency as it relates to our mobility. We're having these technologies that allow us to do things that, when we were probably growing up, we're thinking, wow, wouldn't it be amazing if we didn't have to drive the car, but it could drive itself? It's actually happening now. It's on the streets. I guess, why is this important for cities to understand? It seems like oftentimes technology and its implementation in the built environment is a little bit diverse. It's separated. I always think about the scooters that you see, especially about 5 years ago, they sort of proliferated. And somebody had this idea, let's make these scooters, let's be able to, you can pay for them with a QR code and we'll just throw them on the streets. And then they ended up on the streets. They ended up in canals. They ended up in the sea. They ended up all over the place. It was a kind of a mess. Can you tell us sort of what the situation is with regards to the technology vis-a-vis the policy and how these two sides are working together?
Yeah. That was actually going to be an example I was going to bring up, Alex, so we can talk more about it. But generally, the issue right now I think particularly in the U.S. is policy doesn't really exist. Actually, it's definitely not at the federal level. It's mostly, and they've let kind of cities and states determine what they want to do with this landing tech, and not many states or cities have kind of been forward thinking to be proactive about putting the guide rails, the really important guide rails that the book argues for, but that are really needed to actually ensure that AVs, when they come, are used in ways that actually make our cities better and not reinforce the paradigms that we have to deal with today. And so on the policy level, I think there's a couple of things, right? One is like the importance of cities to get ahead of this tech, right? And so as you just rightly said, Alex, I think with any mobility technologies, and there's a couple examples, right? The scooters, the micromobilities that proliferated definitely in LA and in SF and other cities, right? Because cities didn't get ahead of it, the impacts to the public realm, to pedestrians, to the infrastructure were unintended and also extreme, right? And actually made sometimes situations worse, even though they're trying to address successfully, micromobility and how to travel in that last, first and last mile. And we saw this also with other things, right? Like Uber and Lyft, when they came, maybe around 10 years ago, they proliferated again without cities getting ahead of this, right? And these type of companies, right? Innovation companies, it's the attitude of ask for forgiveness, not for permission, right? So they intentionally capture the market, and then by the time the market has adopted them, it's a little bit too late to kind of rein in the externality. So when Uber and Lyft came, they actually increased traffic congestion on our streets. Or it was only many years later that we actually got the data, or that outsiders were able to analyze the data and understand that they actually increased traffic in cities and that's because Uber and Lyft, actually the competition is not the private vehicle, is actually they draw users away from things like public transit, walking or biking or other modes, right? So they're actually adding miles to the street instead of competing with, which is it's an interesting kind of statistic to look at. And data is a big part of this, right? Their unwillingness to share data so that we can understand their impacts. And that's maybe another question or another conversation. But what's really important, I think, is that cities, and the book argues for cities to really get ahead of this tech because we've seen their negative impacts in the past. So and I think cities, there are things that are in the works, right? So in New York City, we just finally put into place congestion pricing. It's still, political future is murky because of Trump and all this stuff, but it's in place, right? And so that's one policy that starts to tie, an understanding that our infrastructure, right? There are spatial externalities or impacts for the vehicle's use, the vehicle choice you use, right? And then there are possibly economic costs associated with the use of that infrastructure, which is a private use, right? Automobile is private use, right? Only if you own a car can you use that infrastructure, right? So, and why is that accepted as a free resource, right? And there are many other policies that I think need to be put in place that a lot of other cities around the world have done. But here in the city, our car-centric kind of politics, they're initially, when you present these, they're very untenable. But I think what's exciting is there are policies coming in place that start to do this, right? Congestion pricing, some things LA and other cities are doing. Yeah.
Okay, so it's a bit of a fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me situation. So cities are trying to get ahead of the curve in that.
Yeah. And LA was actually smart a little bit about this. It did, like the scooter situation was a mess spatially a bit, but they were smart enough to implement this system called MDS, Mobility Data Specification, because they learned from Uber and Lyft. They learned when Uber and Lyft came, they basically were hoarding their data and refused to share it. And so MDS, when the scooters came, LA was like, you can only operate on our streets if you share your data with us. And through the sharing of that data, they were actually able to sort of begin to regulate, like fence off certain areas of the cities where scooters were able or not able to operate. So things like that start to put in the mechanisms into place for these public-private kind of interactions that I think are critical. Yeah.
Looks like governance and like policy is going to be a major player, but I think, as Americans, we sort of know that public transit here, for lack of a better word, kind of sucks.
Right.
Famously, our dollar does not go as far as many other countries, especially when it comes to public transit. The California high-speed rail has, commonly been ridiculed as a jobs program. So how does that change with AVs? Like, what do you see AVs being different than, say, scooters or Uber that will make kind of policymakers more active and kind of more able to improve the condition of cities through this technology?
Yeah, I think right now we think about, and the way the market has kind of played it out, or that the market share that they're looking at, whether you look at like private companies like Tesla or Ford, who are trying to basically sell you more cars, but just replace your current car with an automated variety, or mobility service companies that are trying to sell you a service of individualized transport, right? That's the model that is playing out now. And I think that's certainly part of it, right? And that's a very important part of it, right? And there are benefits to some of that kind of market playing out. But I think what's really important is we think about it's not about moving vehicles, it's about moving people in space. And how much space do they take up when we move them, right? So think about the vehicle not just as a car which can hold 4 people, right, or 4 or 5 people, But the opportunity for AVs, and there are a couple companies doing this that are looking at the vehicle redesign from ground up, right? And then, maybe smaller mini shuttles that could operate more efficiently, take up less space in like transit deserts, for example, is an exciting opportunity, right? In between, it's like that smart car scale, right? Which is not super popular yet. Even like the kind of like in between bus and car scale, like 4 to 6, right? Or even revolutionizing our bus and express bus, right? And all the range of vehicle sizes where I think the effort is, in my view, is to tie the number of people to the amount of space they take up when they move, right? More on this scale, right? And therefore, instead of the car being used for every single trip length, type, and distance. And so the book argues for transportation agencies and transit agencies to actually absorb the technology and utilize it to fill in these range of geographies and gaps a lot of gaps that exist in transportation system currently, right? And also it argues for public-private partnerships where, right, we always think about public transit as being administered by a public agency and therefore not just funding issues, but also like negative connotations that come with that, right? And it's a lot to ask a city to be, on the, be able to like manage and, provide a high level quality of service, right? Usually that's what we associate with the private sector, right? Is providing a better level of service, right? And on the private side, right, there's always this disconnect in the US between how public transit is administered and private automobility is administered. But if you look at a lot of other cities, there's a lot of great precedents, like in Seoul, right, where the bus system, or Curitiba, right, where they're administered as public-private partnerships, in which, actually private companies run the bus services, but under an umbrella, right? So it's actually, there's competition, there's market, they respond to market demands, right? But it's under an umbrella of public kind of regulation who sets geographies and fares more, right? And that they're working together to, in the end, administer better quality of service and more reach at an affordable price, right? That's a model that we don't really have in the US that could address a lot of the issues of why public transit is so, sucks here, basically. Right?
Well, it seems like there is some movement there, like the Bright Line high-speed rail in Florida, and I think they're establishing one between LA and Las Vegas. That's an example of a private company trying to do transportation, which I think we understand a lot of the issues here, especially when you have a land market that's so privatized. It's very hard to actually acquire space. But I want to go back to your point about creating some sort of metric, basically, for the amount of space that someone takes up when they're on the move. How would one do that? And wouldn't it be very location specific? It seems like the sort of quality and efficacy of public transportation is relative to the accepted density in a particular space. And so if you're talking about New York, it would be very different from LA.
That's a great question. First of all, the metric for moving people shouldn't be, and often like engineers, they talk about the movement through the number of vehicles that can move in a space, right? So we measure, right, the efficiency of a system through vehicles, right, instead of through people, right? And if you guys all may have seen that really famous image from the city of Munich, where you have the image of the bus, you have the same number of people, right, 30 people, how much space that takes up if they all ride a bus versus bicycle versus cars, right? And then the disproportionate space that moving 30 people in different modes of transportation takes, right? And so I think that's a great kind of visual way to get to the idea that, like, if we think about moving people, how do we tie that with the variety of what you mentioned, Alex, which is the densities and the kind of densities of urban fabric that our cities are constituted, right? And so in urban centers or larger transportation, let's say corridors or around TODs, right? Transit-oriented developments in which, right, there are more people, right? How do we implement service like that are more, let's say, fixed route and, because there's more people going to the same location and, are more frequent in that way versus when you get to the suburbs or in the outskirts, right, where you can't necessarily run fixed route service, there's just not enough density people, but then micro shuttles or other scales of moving people in less space, right, that you don't always need a truck or a SUV to get you somewhere if you're only traveling one person, right? How do we match vehicle size to the density of the space? And then in between, what happens in that crossover? And how can some of those things like support these larger things? Meaning that, like, how can a mini shuttle bring you to a transit center that gets you long distance and you take the subway or a long distance rail or an express bus, right? And there are some companies, right? There's one actually I just came across called Gladways. I think it's called Gladways, which is an AV company that their model is actually to work with transit, with public transit. That was really exciting to see. And Waymo has done certain things where they've I think in Phoenix they did a pilot program where they ran AVs to bring people to a subway station or to a rail station, right? So I think those are the exciting kind of partnerships that could come.
But I think quality of service is an important point here for adoption,
Yeah.
right? You mentioned earlier that when Uber and Lyft came to the cities, that they competed against public transit and bikes because in a way they're a little bit more convenient. One of the interest groups that are most outspoken about the adoption of AVs is actually the disabled. It allows them to get from place to place much easier. They're much less discriminated against in terms of getting picked up. And I could imagine a future where AVs are so cheap and so convenient that they just outcompete every other mode of transport. So I know in your book that you very much advocate for the multimodal way of the future. So can you give us a little bit about how that will compete against this possible future of AVs just being kind of the dominant, most preferred, highest quality of service way of travel?
Yeah, I think that the one point we didn't talk explicitly about, but you just brought up, Libo, is how cheap they will be, right? Just economically, and I think it's estimated that in both in bus, but also in like transportation network companies, like 60% of the cost of operating a ride or that vehicle is the human driver cost, right? It's just paying the driver as a contractor, right? So when you remove that cost, right, current companies, they're like obsessed with this technology because that for them that cost 60% is profit, right? We can save that money. But if we think about that cost savings, and especially in a more like, let's say, public good sense, or even a public transit sense, can we reapply that cost to other things that are to fill in the mobility gaps, increase service, increase high level of quality of service, right? Service frequency, things like this. And that's why I think, it needs to be thought of in this larger, broader sense and not just as individual kind of private market operators. I think you also mentioned like the opportunity for the tech to really help underserved or definitely mobility challenged people. I think that's a big kind of push for sure. But also, to fill in a lot of the gaps in transit deserts, places that don't get service, but could possibly get service because it's much cheaper to run them there now. And so, I think with regards to how these things operate, I think there's going to be a mix, right? The private companies they're the ones innovating on the tech, right? So they're going to have the copyrights. I don't know if that's the right term, but the ownership of the technology in terms of the technology itself, right? And so, that model is already happening, right? But I think, but they're operating on public infrastructure, on public goods, right? On city that's owned and regulated by, and needs to be accessible to all people, not just people who can afford that technology. And so, and because we think of our streets as like a free resource, we don't think that, we think that that's okay, right? But I think, if public agencies come in and congestion pricing starts to do this, which is to say that, you have to work within larger structures in which we collectively can kind of address the issues of the transportation issues that our cities can face. You're not exacerbating the issues. Our streets are not a free resource. You have to partake in the system, and here are the mechanisms in place that you need to operate. Then I think that puts into place, it ties into place more of the idea that, and also the question of who our streets are for, and also who are we serving with our mobility options and technologies.
Speaking of commuting costs, and when the sprawl happened, it was more like a balancing act of your commuting cost versus the land cost or the cost of living. So the reason why the sprawl happened, part of the reason could be, the centers are expensive. So you try to commute more on the longer distance because, and still with that travel, you can get to a much lower rent area, much livable area where the housing costs are much lower than the center. How do you see this change, or do you see this change in LA or also monocentric cities like New York or Boston?
Yeah, I think what will end up happening is in the cores, when there are the densities of people and there's already the infrastructure in place to put into place like mass transit or, these other possible scales, that's where, you have the opportunity for this AV tech to be adopted or absorbed or implemented in ways that I think I argue for. And probably what's going to happen is there's going to be, in the book, I outlined 3 scenarios, right? Scenario in which we actually use them only as individualized, single occupant transport. And then, I argue that that's going to actually increase urban sprawl, into new rings of AV exurbs. There's a scenario 2 in which, we transition to fleet and we release car ownership, right? So that releases a lot of land, but they're still single occupant. And then, it may actually further compete with transit. And then option 3 is if we can align all the priorities, right? Then all these design opportunities are unlocked. And they're not exclusive, meaning it's not going to be only A, B, or C or the other or possible other options. But it may be a mix, right? Meaning that in the cores, the possibility for A is much stronger and ideal, and scenario A may end up happening in the rural suburbs or the urban suburbs.
I think that would be the best scenario. Like the centers get stronger, and even the outskirts also have their own centers. So all of it's like suggesting growth in all different areas and making the cities more stronger than before.
Yeah, and I think you all have touched upon this idea of like monocentric versus polycentric, and I think that's really interesting and important because as cities grow, they often, just because of density, they start in a monocentric nature. Right? You don't have enough density to support multiple centers, but as it's like that famous Cedric Price diagram where the historic city is like a boiled egg. The next generation of cities is the egg over easy or fried egg, right? And then the contemporary city is a scrambled egg. It's a mismatch, right? Or a mixed match. And so I think the model for future cities, especially existing cities that are continuing to densify, right? We're now in an era in which people are moving back into cities, right? We see the value of living together and they're densifying, and there's obviously a whole host of issues like housing issues, right, that come with that. But what is the model for the future city is the question, right? Is it to reinforce the monocentric nature? Is it to actually invest in more polycentric natures and then, high density transportation corridors that link them, right? And then in the end, how can technology be used to support what vision, right? Are we densifying inward? Are we sprawling outward, continuing to sprawl outward, which is the model of the 20th century city, and things like that. Yeah.
Play out some scenarios. One is one where you really have widespread adoption of AVs. And I'm curious what the impact is on this one feature that you discussed at the beginning, parking. What would happen to that, what it was, that 22% of space that goes to parking, or the 50% of space in San Bernardino that goes to parking? What are some of the best and highest level uses that we could anticipate for that sort of unlocking of real estate?
Yeah. And this is where I really argue for designers, architects, developers, urban planners, and designers really to claim a seat at the table that we don't have, right? Nobody's talking about that question that you asked, Alex, right? Is who gets to decide? Well, a lot of it is certainly private property, right? But developers might look at redeveloping it, and also street parking, for example, is a huge thing, right? And that's a public realm good, right? And so the issue is that that's where our agency is, right? Design and imagining what that space could be and what program are used for that space, right? That is where we need to come to the conversation. And it's really missing in, this conversation about parking, right? And I think economy is driving these decisions. And obviously, we live in that, a neoliberal kind of structure, so that will always drive it, right? But how do we start to implement and reclaim that space and rethink about that space, especially street parking, right, as a public good that can serve other uses, like, the many uses of our streets that are not just about moving cars, but they serve important, environmental uses. Can we shade our streets and bring down urban heat island effects, right? Can we use that infrastructure or that reclaimed space for blue systems, right? So we know flooding is a major issue in climate change and inland flooding from the backing up of our, systems. So can we think about blue-green systems, right? Rain gardens, biosoils, et cetera. Even social public uses, right? We actually don't think about our streets as economic commercial spaces, but that they're distinctly tied with that, right? Even the idea of street vending and things like this, right? How can we claim space for other types of, economic uses? And of course, social uses, playgrounds, right? like in our history, streets were the playgrounds for our children. And it was only when vehicles arrived that they were segregated into designated playground spaces, fenced off, right? And how do we use streets as social spaces again? So that's where the agency of the designer really, I think, needs to come and have a role. And we think about densifying, right? How do we think about densifying with housing, right? Which is a persistent need, and affordable housing, which is critical, but also adaptively reusing some of the existing architectures, right? I've always been interested in running a studio on like parking garages. What can we do with parking garages, right? Because they have all this infrastructure has embodied carbon. Highways, that's a huge one, right? It has all this embodied carbon. Yes, you can tear it down and do something else, which is also an exciting opportunity. But how can we transform existing built infrastructure and adaptively use that infrastructure into something new? And that's where the urban designer, can really have a voice. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to, from a development standpoint, I think that it's going to be really dependent on who owns the land. Like I can just
Yeah,
imagine,
for sure.
A museum will transform it into an outdoor sculpture park, their parking lot. An existing multifamily residential developer will add more units. A golf course will add 9 holes. Like I feel like it's going to be up to whoever owns a space and it's going to align with their current interests. I mean, I think the major one is the government, basically, because it's sort of publicly, I guess, held and controlled. Trying to use that space for public good would make the most sense.
It's very exciting to imagine a parking-less city, and it is certainly where the city policies are going for urban development, for especially multifamily uses. They remove the requirement for per unit per parking. But also, I also want to think that, for AVs, they need to be parked somewhere, right? Like they're not going to be vanishing itself.
Yep.
So what will be the parking systems for AV? Can you give us a breakdown on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, in urban cores, I mean, they're also need to charge, right? They park to charge, right? I think that's a big. So you're gonna see these we're gonna see these depots, right? Like AV parking depots. We've seen these depots for these scooters. I mean, we know bus depots, right, and other things like this. So, I think because of land value and land pressure, they're gonna be probably more on the outskirts, right? They're not gonna be located in urban cores. But even that is a new typology, right? Because we designed the way we park cars around human driving and the kind of errors that come with that. But what happens when, vehicles not only, right, and they're also unidirectional, right? We drive moving in one direction, right? But these AVs can go unidirectional. And so, or some, if you reinvent the vehicle, they can, right? Like the Waymo one can't currently, right? Because they're retrofitting. But in a future in which I assume that a lot of these vehicles are designed from scratch, right? How do we design infrastructure that can support, storing and charging these vehicles, right? But take up less urban space, right? Much of the parking garage is actually from the ramps, from driving, right? Human driving, right? And so I think that'll play out in really interesting ways. And who's designing these things too? It's always engineers in our history, but how can we design them with more of a, human-centric focus or other kind of focuses? Yeah.
It seems that
Exciting
one
challenge.
sort of acknowledgement in your work is that, especially in America, cities were built around the car. Like if we compare to European cities, which didn't have that technology and when cities were emerging, I mean, it's primarily horse and buggy type spaces. That's why you have much smaller cars in Europe. A midsize here is like a giant car over there. How do we sort of go at this again? Because we're not going to reinvent our cities, but I think your argument is that we do need to update them somehow. And yet we're dealing with an industry that is so used to just pushing out sort of software patches and changing things over the airwaves. But when we're dealing with hardware, when we're dealing with actually the built environment, you can't update as easily or as efficiently. So what are some of the things that we'll need to do, or maybe some of the frameworks or paradigms that we need to change our mind around that will allow us to really think about how do we renovate cities progressively while the technology is emerging?
Yeah, and this is where I think it's really exciting to think about, like in our current contemporary age, where digital advancement and even digital space, starts to become an overlay onto the physical space, right? So yes, like our actual hard infrastructures, I think that's what I'm really excited about is the infrastructure part, both in highways, but also street infrastructure. How do we redesign it in a physical way? But then how can digital uses or digital technologies that are overlaid onto physical space also begin to allow for that, let's say, mixing or transformation or conversion more seamlessly, right? When you design hard infrastructure, it's fixed. You have to it's like that use is there, right? But are there other things like, for example, we talked a little bit about geofencing, right? But can, like, for example, the street be designed or like rethought in a way in which the uses change, right, at different times of the day, because there's either signs or even the lane changes, or even the, infrastructure allows for, let's say, during rush hour, you need 3 lanes in both direction. You use all 3 lanes, right? Because we need it. We need to move people, right? But during lunch hour, suddenly the 3 lanes gets reduced to 1 lane, and the other 2 lanes are for people to come out and have their lunch, right? And how can the infrastructure allow for these changing uses, more dynamic uses? How do we think about how digital overlays onto space, right? Maybe bollards start to come up to block off or whatever, right? And geofencing is another thing, right? Which is how do we actually redirect flows of traffic to allow for places in the city where we don't want cars maybe in certain times of the day, and it becomes car free. And then when we need them, right, suddenly the geofencing boundaries change. And this is all actually can be seamlessly integrated into, the software over system, right? Because it's not literally somebody moving to the street and putting a traffic cone there to allow you to, but it's actually built into driverless technology, right? The softwares where we don't even have to do it. It's like built into it, right? And so they already redistribute. So that's, I think, really exciting.
Okay, so like an advocacy for hardware infrastructure to become softer, essentially, become more malleable, more adaptable.
Right.
I think maybe here I would like to advocate for a slightly different conception of software, and I think that's events. One of the coolest reuses of parking I've seen is a music festival in downtown Vegas, where they took over all the parking lots, and you have, instead of a music festival out in the field, you have it in this very urban environment. You're actually walking down the streets to go to these different venues that are repurposed parking lots. And in the book, a lot of the things that you imagine to be in the future, the technology already exists today, right? We can already automate subways, we can already automate buses, there's already automated taxis, bollards can already be automated. But what is something that the technology enables that we don't see today? Something that's new, that's emerging, that can't yet happen with what we have today?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I actually think the argument I make is the argument that all the things that are in the book can actually happen without automation, right? But automation just makes them more possible and easier. I mean, I do think that, like, the idea of it becoming more seamless, where like the hardwares and the softwares are much more intertwined, I think that's part of it. Or even the idea that, like, we digitally reconstitute, like, the ground as like a seamless digital space. Like, I mean, in this kind of utopic future in which there's you rethink the whole ground plane, you rethink the rights of uses, right? And it becomes like reprogrammable different times of the day. And that's something that I think requires a technological interconnection, right, between physical space and urban and digital space that you just can't do when you don't think about it in a digital way. But I think the book actually argues for the opposite, which is in some sense that, like, there are mechanisms in place that cities can already do to reclaim urban space, right? We saw it you've seen it in here, right? At Libo in New York, where in, like, maybe the past decade under Jeanette Seri-Kang, who was our transportation director under Mayor Bloomberg, they actually reclaimed some of the most highly congested spaces of our city, Herald Square, Times Square, which were, the most congested for cars. And, you asked them at the time, like, can we take space away from cars and give it to people? And you'd be laughed off the street. And they did it. And now those spaces have remained, right? So the pedestrianization of these spaces that were the most congested, right? So these are actually, and there was no automation technology at the time. There was an investment into re-looking at infrastructure, the design of the infrastructure, and also into bus transit and other kind of messaging. And so there are mechanisms put in place that can put into the steps already this reclamation of space. And we must use new technologies to support that. Otherwise, if we let the market determine it, then it may be a grab back in the other direction, right? To reinforce.
But I think that's where actually one of the I think the barriers exist, right? It's easy for cities to push back against like private vehicles reclaiming the streets. And I agree with you, those spaces
Yeah.
are awesome. And it's great to go to Times Square and, actually be able to walk in the middle and be in the crowd. It feels really immersive. It feels great to just, feel the energy that's there. But I think we've seen recently that there's major pushback to automation, especially from labor,
Agree.
from unions. And
Yeah.
that's probably one of the biggest barriers to the New York subway becoming more efficient. We saw with the dock workers strike how they've added kind of blockers to automation as a part of their contract. Like
Yeah.
labor is a big participant
Yeah.
in elections. They're a big kind of special interest group. How do you see their kind of point of view changing? Because there is going to be a lot of job displacement.
100%. And, it's terrifying the taxi drivers. It's terrifying the Uber and Lyft drivers, right? Because they're all out of jobs now. I think what we have to remember is that, with any technological catalyst or revolution, labor shifts, right? And yes, certain types of jobs are inevitably displaced. And we see this with every technology. We see with AI, there's that huge, concern. But new types of jobs are created. And it's about maybe thinking about shifting workforces and thinking about shifting labor forces and types of labor jobs, right? So in automation, right, I think part of the book, actually, one of the stories in the comics looks at how instead of a bus driver who has lost her job because she doesn't drive the bus anymore, she actually shifts into a new role. And this is a possibility, right, when we're talking about increasing level of service, right? Which is, if we think about bus drivers, we think about their only job is to drive the bus. It's actually not just that. That's like half of it. They actually have to technically provide for the safety of the passengers. Sometimes they give directions, right? They have to assist the elderly. There's other jobs that they're forced to do that they actually don't do because they have to be driving the car or the vehicle, right? So are there other roles like a mobility concierge? I don't know, like somebody whose job is to actually do all those things and they're released of the job to drive the car, or other obviously more, innovation related jobs related to producing that technology or managing it, right? That we can think about how these labor forces can shift. It's every technology that comes, we have this debate, right? And there's new jobs created and jobs lost, and it's this kind of like transition toward a future, right? Because technology is inevitable. You either use it or you get left behind because other people are using it,
I
right?
think that's a great point. Yeah, the human touch of the experience is something that can be only unique to humans to provide to other humans. So maybe that part of the aspect is gets more important than just the technicality of driving a bus or a car.
Right, right.
And I would say the thing about the built environment is it takes an incredible amount of labor, a lot of work to actually make it happen. And Libo talked about the longshoremen. I mean, the incredible pushback that you get from contractor unions towards modular construction is basically has killed any potential for that in California. So I think that is one of the larger headwinds that this domain, that the built environment, whether it's design, engineering, that sort of thing, faces. Another one of the headwinds is just, especially around cars, is culture. People in America, especially, but in a lot of the Anglophone world, want a car because it symbolizes freedom. You don't have to wait for somebody; you can just get in and go. And I think it's clear, like in California, in Texas, in Florida, cities are built around that mentality. How do we get around that? And how do you advocate, I guess, for an incentive for people to shift that mindset and say, okay, maybe I can use this autonomous vehicle that's shared or is publicly operated instead of having my giant pickup truck?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's like a chicken and it's a chicken and egg problem, right? We often assume that not having the choice to drive is the same as choosing not to drive, right? And so we think that like the culture comes because we've demanded it. We've like and yes, part of it is certainly right, 100% tied to right American ideals of private land ownership and access to it, right? The private car, even the celebration of the car, like the fact that getting a driver's license is a rite of passage, getting our first car is a rite of passage, car clubs, car shows, right? Auto shows, right? We often forget that like it was actually when cars came, we resisted them initially, right? And it was political interests, like the market didn't want them in some ways. It was political interests and the kind of economy of like trying to sell cars and then rebuilding our infrastructure, right? And the redefining of terms, like the invention of the term jaywalking was actually promoted by motordom, which is, this collection of like automobile promoters, to cast the blame of like traffic fatalities on the pedestrian, and to redefine that, like that the car use is actually, a car culture is a thing, right? That we actually use our infrastructure for cars, right? And so, in history, it was these larger interest bodies that actually put mechanisms into place that then made driving, alternative driving, very difficult, and that you had no other choice. And then through history, that became completely integrated and ingrained in our culture. And so when we think about moving forward, I think one of the things, it's like, what's the chicken and the egg? You change the culture or you change the infrastructure block, And I think you got to start there's no start or end. I think you got to do both. But one of the biggest things is, I think that if you change the options and the infrastructure, behavior will follow. And we see this in New York, right? It's the only, let's say, one of the few more transit, readily, available cities in the US. And most people use it. It's like a place where all walks of life come together, right? Where the rich people use, subway just as much as, lower income. And so, when it's difficult to drive, people actually choose to do other modes of transportation, right? And so can we build the things into place that then the culture can follow? And also, can we be really attuned to the way new forms of media and culture are implementing or messaging certain status quo? So like, for example, in 2017, Ford used this term, or invented this new term called the pedestrian, right? It's like their new version of the jaywalking, which is like to cast the blame of like traffic fatalities on distracted pedestrians that are on their phones and not looking where they're going, right? And so like and Hollywood is distinctly tied to like the celebration and the proliferation of a car. We don't have a movie called Buses, right? We have a movie in Pixar called Cars, literally, right? And so, the celebration of that, right? And so for me, I think culture will follow, right? If you provide other choices, consumer behavior will fall into line. And I'm also not anti-car, by the way. I always have to give this disclaimer, right? I actually love, when I lived in LA, I loved driving actually because of the kind of personal space you had. And, I'm not anti-car. What I am is anti-car dependency, which is that when there's no other choices, then you have to do it, right? And then that becomes the culture, right? But if you have more choices, I think people will use those choices. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I think you make a good case that only being able to drive a car is not a form of freedom. It's in fact quite imprisoning. But if we had more ways to get around a city, we would feel more free, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, there's times when I was living in New York when I really wished I had a car so that I could get out of the city,
sometimes
where
it's useful,
I could move my
right?
stuff.
For groceries. Right,
exactly. Yeah. And then there's other times when it's much more convenient just to take the 465 uptown instead of trying to get in a taxi.
Totally. Yeah.
I want to take a moment also to talk about the book, which we have right here. It's quite nice. I mean, it's a beautiful artifact. And I want to ask you a question. Why did you decide to make your life hard and make two books, one of which is a graphic novel and one of which is a much more traditional, thoroughly researched account of transportation?
Yeah. So it's perfect timing because we were just talking about the cultural aspect of this, right? And I think, you could call it a naive attempt, but an attempt to provide a different form of messaging and media and communication that is not car-centric, right? So the graphic novel is as the second book, right? Because we haven't talked about that as much. So it was an attempt to actually, and we often in academia and in practice, or even in the engineering spheres, we talk in our own languages. We talk in languages that make sense to us, but the public, the people that are actually using this, they have no idea what you're talking about. Like they don't even know how to read a plan sometimes, or an axonometric drawing or whatever, right? So, how can we put into place other forms of media, messaging, communication, visualizations that can talk to a wider public, comic book, right? That can really change people's minds, hopefully, through imagining new possible ways of moving around that they can't think about today, right? Because they're so dependent on the car or on individual driving. And so the second book is a medium that's meant to like address the cultural aspect of this conversation. And also the point of having two instead of having one is that the book itself as an artifact can also be distributed to different stakeholders. You can actually just take the comic portion of it and pass it to, I don't know, your kids or something like this, right? And the other one can talk to more the urban designers, the planners, historians, yada, yada, yada. But then also that they importantly support each other, right? So if you only read the comic, you're like, okay, this utopia is great. How do we get there, right? What are the steps, right? And then you have to read the book one to understand, okay, policy, design, these are the steps that put that into place. At the same time, we have to have that vision to understand how book one, what are the goals to aim for in book one, right? So if you read book one, what are possibilities that could emerge if we do this in this way, right? So it's not just a history book. There are history components, but it's the future visioning part of it that can that put the values and principles towards this larger spatial goal.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is really important. A lot of what we do and what we talk about on this podcast, it's really hard to actually visualize it. So for you to take the step and use your skills to actually show it instead of just telling as a principle, I think is really amazing. So I do recommend everybody to pick up the copy of the book, Transitopia, Towards a New Transitopia, sorry. So that you can either pick it up and read it while you're maybe in an AV, or you can consume it in another manner as well.
Yeah, you don't have to be driving anymore. Just read the book instead.
When is it out in stores?
It was out in November last fall, so just a few months ago. Yeah, so it's.
And we'll link to a way to buy it in the comments down below.
Awesome. Thanks.
So where are you taking this research next, if you don't mind me asking?
I think I need to step away from it a little bit. Just from PTSD from, no, not really. But so I've done a couple of things. Like right now I'm very much in like press and promo stage. I'm giving a lot of book talks. But I also just put on an exhibition at New York Tech where a lot of this, requires you to read it, right? Because that's the form of the book, right? But I'm trying to find ways to visualize it more, right? So the exhibition was actually, we built all these models, typological models that visualize, spatialize all the, scales of design scenarios that could emerge, right? And then it visualizes the graphic novel and large scale graphics. And that exhibition is going to be moving actually into the city in the fall at a gallery here. So, ways for, again, to disseminate that information. And then, just thinking, I think longer term about the relationship that infrastructure and mobility and architecture have. For me, that's always an interesting question that I'll be continuing to look at and research. But really this idea that our mobility choices and our mobility cultures are distinctly tied to our urban ambitions and our societal ambitions, right? How do we want our cities to look like in the future? Like from this kind of ambitious society level question. And then what are the choices, mobilities and other things, right, that we can use to get us there.
Well, I think that's a good place to ask our final question that we ask all our guests about on this show. Basically, Libo, Minku, and I, we are trying to figure out what moment we're in right now. How do we describe the current condition? And so from your perspective, Evan, as someone who is an architect and an urbanist, but also has delved deeply into not only the way that cities are constructed around mobility, but also these new emerging technologies that are on our doorstep right now. In the next generation, when we look back on our current moment, when we recorded this pod, how are people going to describe the era that we're living in right now?
Yeah, I think we're in a really, I think the technology that comes to mind, of course, and you guys had a podcast already about this, which is artificial intelligence. The answer to that question about what you think we are in depends on if you're an optimist or a pessimist or a realist, right, or combination. And for me, I think any sort of new technology that comes in, we have to be both realistic, but we have to be optimistic about it, right? And you have to be somewhere in the middle. And you have to be, I think if you're a pessimist, the issue is if you want to ignore technology, like it's coming no matter whether you like it or not, it's coming, right? The market is making it happen. And so you either embrace it, right, and use it for the values and principles that we should collectively determine as designers or as citizens, right? Or it'll be used in other ways that we don't have a hand in, right? And so we have to be realistic about the realities of technology, the negative impacts, right? AI, we talk about, the massive amount of data centers and energy it consumes, right? Out of sight, out of mind often. AVs, we talk about increasing the possibility for increasing congestion, urban sprawl, these other things, right? But be realistic about that. We can't be naive and utopic, right? We can't just be like, no technology in and by itself is a cure-all. It's a silver bullet, nothing, right? It's a tool, right? So we have to be realistic about its negative and positive effects, and we also have to be optimistic. Otherwise, why are we here, right? Why would I'm, I think, an eternal optimist because, otherwise, why would I write this book, I guess? But but we have to be optimistic about how that technology can then be used for, things that we want our cities to look and be like, right? So I think it's that type of realistic, optimistic embrace that is critical in this moment in time, particularly and in future as any incoming technology starts to change our world around us.
Yeah, indeed. I think balance is key, and it's the hardest thing to achieve. Evan, thank you so much for being on the show. If people want to find out more about you or your work, where can they go?
Yeah, so you can look up the book, I guess. Though the link is in the podcast chat. But also feel free to look up my design and research practice. So that's Emergent Studio, emergent-studio.com. And you can follow that for upcoming research and design projects that I'm working on as well.
Wonderful. Well, Evan Shieh is an architect, urbanist, and assistant professor of architecture at New York Institute of Technology. He is the author of the recent book, Towards a New Transitopia. Thanks for being on the pod, Evan.
Thank you. So nice to chat with you guys today. Thanks for your time.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern. 모스트 포던 팟캐스트